You are already running a philosophy, whether you chose it or not. Every reaction, every standard, every ambition and fear, these are not random quirks of personality, but the output of code installed by forces you never consciously invited. Family, culture, authority, peers, algorithms, these silent installers have shaped the architecture of your mind, dictating how you interpret conflict, pursue meaning, and respond to pressure. Most men drift through life executing this borrowed script, mistaking inherited reflex for identity, and wondering why their best intentions collapse the moment reality applies heat. This book is not another collection of motivational slogans or a parade of ancient wisdom to be admired and forgotten. It is a blueprint for authorship. Here, you will learn to treat philosophy as an engineer treats code, as something to be audited, tested, and deliberately rewritten. You will discover how to identify the hidden rules running your life, strip out the contradictions, and install a set of principles that can actually survive contact with chaos. You will not be asked to join a tribe or adopt a badge. Instead, you will raid the world's battle-tested traditions, Stoicism, Bushido, Zen, Taoism, Existentialism, not to cosplay as a philosopher, but to extract the modules that solve your real problems. You will learn to build a kernel of unbreakable rules, construct an emotional firewall, and deploy a decision engine that operates faster than panic or ego. You will train these principles until they become reflex, not performance. You will run audits, patch failures, and upgrade your system as your life evolves. You will learn to run multiple modules in parallel, assigning each to its proper domain, gaining range without losing coherence. This is not about perfection. It is about clarity. It is about building version 1.0 of a personal operating system that can withstand the pressures of your actual life. Success is not measured by how often you fail, but by how quickly you catch yourself, review the crash, and refine your code. Drift is the default. Authorship is the only alternative. The chapters ahead will take you from invisible programming to conscious engineering. You will move from imitation to authorship, from emotional hijacking to deliberate conduct, from consuming ideas to generating identity. The payoff is not theoretical. It is the compound effect of clean code, better judgment, steadier relationships, resilient composure, and a life that is built, not borrowed. You do not need another man's operating system. You need one that survives your life. This book is your build sequence. Audit your code, extract your modules, install your kernel, train your responses, upgrade your system, deploy your philosophy in the real world. You are not a bundle of moods. You are the architect of your conduct. Begin. Chapter 1. Borrowed Code. Everything you believe about your own character is likely a total fabrication. You think you are making independent choices, but you are actually executing a script written by people who are not you. You are already running a philosophy. Your reactions, your standards, your fears, your ambition, your sense of duty, and your emotional habits are all running on mental code, but there is a very good chance you did not build it consciously. This chapter will expose the default programming that dictates your life. You will see exactly how inherited beliefs and cultural scripts have hijacked your agency, and you will learn the first step to taking the controls back. By the time you finish reading this section, you will understand why your current self-improvement efforts evaporate under pressure and how to begin constructing an architecture that actually holds. The invisible architecture running your life. Think of your mind as a machine running an operating system. Just as a computer's operating system determines how every application functions, your core assumptions determine how you interpret events, regulate emotion, make decisions, respond to setbacks, and define success. Most men spend their lives downloading new apps. They collect habits, productivity hacks, morning routines, and motivational quotes. They ignore the kernel underneath. But if the kernel is corrupted, the apps cannot save you. Every decision you make runs on hidden assumptions long before conscious thought ever appears. Human beings do not begin from neutrality. You were programmed. There are 5 silent installers of borrowed code that built your current operating system. First, family conditioning installed your earliest rules about power, conflict, money, and emotion. You watched how your parents handled stress, and you quietly downloaded their panic or their avoidance. You learned whether anger was a weapon or a sin, and you still run that exact script today. Second, culture installed scripts about masculinity, status, and belonging. It told you what a successful man looks like, and you accepted the blueprint without checking the measurements. You absorbed the idea that your worth is tied to your output, your stoicism, or your dominance. Third, school and authority figures installed obedience patterns and approval dependency. They taught you to wait for permission, to fear the red pen, and to measure your intelligence by how well you memorized someone else's answers. Fourth, your peer groups installed imitation loops and the deep fear of exclusion. You learned to adjust your personality to avoid standing out in the wrong way. You adopted the cynical humor of your friends, the complaints of your coworkers, and the limitations of your neighborhood. Finally, the algorithms installed fragmented beliefs disguised as wisdom. The internet feeds you emotional shortcuts, out-of-context quotes, and aggressive posturing that feels like strength but shatters on impact. This borrowed philosophy fails under real pressure because quotes do not become character by exposure alone. You can read all the ancient wisdom in the world, but borrowed rules collapse the moment they conflict with your older, deeper conditioning. You cannot debug a system you have never examined. The patchwork mind under pressure. This invisible code reveals itself in your daily life through a phenomenon called the patchwork mind. The patchwork mind is a collection of disconnected beliefs with no governing architecture. It is one part ancient warrior quote, one part fear of judgment, one part family conditioning, and one part internet bravado. This contradiction creates massive internal drag and decision fatigue. You are constantly negotiating with yourself. One day, you wake up and decide to be a ruthless executor. The next day, you read a post about self-compassion and you let all your standards collapse. You swing violently between extreme discipline and extreme apathy because you have no central kernel to govern your choices. Look at your career. You know exactly what you need to do to advance, but approval anxiety overrides your action. You freeze when it is time to speak up because a hidden script tells you that standing out is dangerous. You tell yourself you are just being strategic, but the truth is you are being obedient to ghost code. Look at your relationships. You say you want calm and rational communication, but the moment you feel criticized, old defensiveness takes over. Your chest tightens, your voice raises, and you fight to protect your ego instead of solving the problem. You use the language of boundaries to justify your own inability to handle friction. Look at your money. You make rational plans when you are calm, and then you sabotage them emotionally the moment you feel insecure or envious of another man's status. You buy things you do not need to impress people you do not like because a cultural script told you that respect is purchased. This is the stark difference between a winner and a loser. The loser runs invisible code and calls it his personality. He defends his conditioning as his identity. When he explodes in anger or folds under pressure, he blames the world for triggering him. The winner audits his code before he blames the world. The winner audits his reactions, tests his assumptions, and takes ownership of the architecture of his life. Winners choose principles. Losers inherit reactions. The brutal cost of leaving the default code untouched. If you do nothing about this, your future is entirely predictable. You will keep repeating the exact same mistakes with brand new explanations. You will fail, and you will complain, and you will rationalize, and you will start over, and you will fail again. You will keep admiring a level of strength you cannot access under pressure. You will confuse the intake of information with actual growth, mistaking the reading of a book for the building of a life. There is a pressure test coming, and you will keep failing it. A bad day at work will still have the power to rewrite your entire identity. A simple conflict will still expose the rules you never consciously chose. Inevitable setbacks will still trigger collapse, rage, or retreat. This is the hidden penalty of philosophical drift. When you lack an examined operating system, you become easy prey for trends, tribes, and strong personalities. You build habits on unstable foundations and wonder why they do not last. You mistake your own inconsistency for complexity, telling yourself that you are just a complicated man when in reality you are just an unorganized one. Consider this an identity-level warning. A man without examined principles is highly programmable. A man who will not inspect his code will repeat his damage indefinitely. If you do nothing right now, other people will keep deciding how you think. Your life is already running on code. If you did not write it, you cannot trust it. Drift is still a decision, and it is the most expensive decision you can make. The compound power of a custom operating system. When you finally strip out the borrowed code and install your own, the compound effect is staggering. You move from emotional hijacking to emotional processing. You move from imitation to authorship. You move from drift to direction. Over time, you will make vastly better decisions under pressure because your rules are already defined before the chaos hits. You will experience faster emotional recovery because your reactions become easier to read and regulate. You will feel less inner contradiction because your principles finally align with your actions. This creates a permanent, long-term identity shift. You stop seeing yourself as a chaotic bundle of moods, and you start seeing yourself as the deliberate architect of your conduct. You become incredibly hard to manipulate, flatter, distract, or derail. The real-world payoff touches every domain of your existence. In your career, you develop cleaner judgment, stronger boundaries, and steadier performance. In your relationships, you display less reactivity, clearer speech, and absolute reliability. With your money, you exhibit less impulsiveness, more consistency, and better strategic patience. You stop borrowing identity, and you start generating it. Building version 1.0. The goal of your first pass through this process is not instant enlightenment. The goal is to build version 1.0 of your personal operating system. Success here is defined by clarity, not perfection. Success is a working internal model, not a finished masterpiece. Success is catching yourself sooner, not never failing again. You should be able to identify your current default code in the areas of control, pain, respect, and responsibility. You will name your top crash patterns under stress. You will draft a handful of kernel principles that fit your actual messy reality. You will gain immediate practical wins this week. You will notice your emotional triggers faster. You will make one cleaner, high-pressure decision. You will stop copying other men's frameworks blindly and start engineering your own. The core build sequence. To get there, you must follow a precise build sequence. Step 1 is to audit the existing code. You must review your last 5 overreactions, hesitations, and bad decisions and label the beliefs beneath those behaviors. Step 2 is to gather better source material. You will explore source libraries to extract proven modules without joining a cult of personality. You will learn to view ancient traditions not as religions to join, but as toolkits to raid. Step 3 is to choose your kernel rules. You will reduce your philosophy to a few non-negotiables that can survive pain, pressure, and uncertainty. You will strip away the decorative beliefs and keep only the load-bearing pillars. Step 4 is to install through training. You will construct an emotional firewall to process feelings cleanly and a decision engine to act faster than panic. You will run a training loop to convert these principles into automatic behaviors. Step 5 is to debug and deploy. You will use an upgrade cycle to track what breaks and patch weak modules without ego. Eventually, you will run parallel mines to handle different classes of problems with the exact right tool. The default code audit. Winners treat their beliefs like code that must be tested. They prefer ugly truth over flattering illusion, and they build systems before chasing intensity. Losers collect quotes and call it wisdom. They copy confidence before building character, and they want certainty without examination. The core mindset shift required right now is to stop asking which philosopher to follow and start asking what your life actually demands. Stop performing insight and start engineering behavior. To do this, you must run the default code audit. This requires answering 5 brutal questions about your current programming. First, what what do you believe about what you control? Second, what do you believe about pain and discomfort? Third, what do you believe about respect and status? Fourth, what do you believe about responsibility and blame? Fifth, what do you believe about meaning and purpose? You might think you control your outcomes, and fix this by realizing you only control your effort. The moment you detach your self-worth from the final result and attach it entirely to your daily execution, you eliminate half the anxiety in your life. You might view pain as an injustice, and fix this by reframing discomfort as the exact friction required for growth. When you stop running from the fire and start using it to forge your discipline, adversity becomes an asset instead of a tragedy. You might tie your respect to external validation, and fix this by anchoring your status entirely to your own adherence to your standards. When your self-respect depends on the applause of strangers, you are a slave. When it depends on keeping your own promises, you are sovereign. You might blame your circumstances for your failures, and fix this by assuming total responsibility for your responses. The conditions of your life may not be your fault, but the architecture of your reaction is entirely your responsibility. You might wait for meaning to be handed to you, and fix this by choosing a purpose and executing it daily. Meaning is not a lost object you find under a rock. Meaning is a structure you build with your own hands through deliberate action. Once you see the bad code, you cannot unsee it. The illusion is broken. But seeing the corrupted architecture is not enough to save you when the pressure spikes. You need better raw material to replace the scripts you are about to delete. The next move is not blind rejection of everything you know. The next move is smart, ruthless selection. You cannot build a strong system out of weak materials, and the tools you need are hidden in places you have likely misunderstood your entire life. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to Grow to the Top and activate notifications to receive more self-improvement tips that will supercharge your growth. And make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. It really helps the channel grow. Thank you for your support. Chapter 2, Source Libraries. You are walking around with a head full of borrowed quotes and a life full of identical mistakes. You read a profound statement about discipline in the morning. You feel a temporary surge of power, and then you completely lose your composure when a minor inconvenience disrupts your afternoon. You consume endless streams of ancient wisdom, yet your actual behavior under pressure remains completely unchanged. This happens because you are treating philosophy like a museum exhibit instead of a toolkit. You are admiring the hammer instead of driving the nail. This chapter will fundamentally change how you interact with human wisdom. You will stop looking for a tribe to join and start looking for raw materials to extract. You will learn to view the greatest traditions in history not as sacred identities to adopt, but as battle-tested code bases designed to solve very specific human problems. By the time you finish this section, you will know exactly where to look when your current operating system fails, and you will understand how to gather the exact components you need to rebuild it. Drowning in the shallows. You are probably drowning in fragments. You have heard the Stoic quotes about controlling your reactions. You have heard the Zen cliches about being present in the moment. You have heard the warrior slogans about relentless discipline and honor. But you have absorbed them without knowing what specific problem each one was actually engineered to solve. You mistake exposure for understanding because the modern internet rewards fragments, not systems. The algorithm feeds you emotional shortcuts disguised as deep wisdom. It gives you a 10-second video of a man talking about mental toughness, and you feel a hit of dopamine that tricks your brain into thinking you have actually accomplished something. You are doing this right now when you admire language you cannot apply. You nod along to a profound concept, you save the quote to your phone, and then you go right back to your default programming. The second life gets difficult. The real cost of this philosophical confusion is massive. When you do not understand the specific utility of a concept, you reach for the wrong tool when the pressure spikes. Career pressure hits you hard, and you reach for rigid discipline when you really need objective judgment. Relationship conflict escalates, and you reach for cold detachment when you really need grounded presence. Money stress makes you panic, and you force immediate action when you really need strategic patience. You are using a wrench to drive a screw and wondering why the architecture of your life keeps collapsing. This exposes the stark contrast between a winner and a loser in the arena of personal development. Winners ask what specific problem a piece of knowledge solves. Losers ask which tribe this knowledge makes them look like they belong to. Winners look at a philosophy and extract the mechanics of execution. Losers look at a philosophy and buy the t-shirt. Winners build an internal system that holds under fire. Losers cosplay as philosophers, while their actual lives remain chaotic, reactive, and entirely out of their control. The architecture of ancient code. To escape this trap, you must understand the concept of source libraries. Think of a source library as a philosophical codebase that you can study, extract from, and combine with other tools. You are not joining a religion of personality. You are not swearing absolute allegiance to a dead emperor or a wandering swordsman. You are choosing useful modules to install into your own custom operating system. Modular thinking retains better than vague admiration because it attaches a specific tool to a specific job. There are 5 core libraries you must understand. The first is Stoicism. This is your library of control, objective judgment, and disciplined perception. It is the code you run when you need to separate your emotional surges from the actual facts of a situation. The second is Bushido. This is your library of honor, absolute readiness, and decisive conduct. It is the code you run when you need to eliminate hesitation and act with total commitment. The third is Zen. This is your library of attention, immediate presence, and non-lagged awareness. It is the code you run when your mind is trapped in the past or the future and you need to lock on to the exact reality of the present second. The fourth is Taoism. This is your library of adaptability, precise timing, and non-forcing. It is the code you run when brute force is failing and you need to find the natural leverage in a situation. The fifth is Existentialism. This is your library of radical responsibility, meaning, and chosen purpose. It is the code you run when the world feels absurd, the rules collapse, and you must forge your own reason to keep moving forward. The governing law of these libraries is the rule of functional fit. A philosophy is only useful when it helps you act better under pressure. A philosophy is completely weak when it sounds deep but changes absolutely nothing in your daily conduct. Admiration is not installation. If a concept does not change how you speak, how you decide, or how you recover from a hit, it is useless to you. Live fire testing. You must see what this looks like in the brutal reality of your daily life. Imagine a career scenario involving public pressure and a direct threat to your ego. Your manager criticizes your work in front of your peers. Your default code screams at you to defend yourself, to attack back, or to shrink into silent resentment. If you pull from the Stoic library, you instantly separate the objective feedback from the emotional insult. You process the data and discard the disrespect. If you pull from the Zen library, you reduce the reaction lag before you speak. You breathe, you anchor to the present moment, and you respond with a steady voice instead of a defensive stutter. Consider a relationship scenario involving conflict and rapid emotional escalation. A hard conversation with your partner triggers your deep defensiveness, and you start keeping score. You bring up past mistakes to deflect from your current failure. If you pull from the Taoist library, you stop forcing the exchange. You realize that pushing harder against resistance only creates more resistance, so you yield strategically to let the anger pass. If you pull from the Stoic library, you take absolute ownership of your side of the mess, and you completely release your need to control their reaction. Look at a money scenario driven by fear, scarcity, and quiet desperation. A financial setback makes you feel incredibly behind in life, and you are tempted to make a reckless, impulsive move just to feel like you are doing something. If you pull from the existentialist library, you force radical responsibility instead of indulging in self-pity. You accept that you chose the risks, and you must own the consequences. If you pull from the Bushido library, You demand disciplined, methodical action from yourself instead of emotional flailing. You execute the recovery plan without caring how you feel about it. Contrast this with the identity scenario of the borrowed sage. This is when you repeat a famous philosopher's language without matching their behavior. You use one tradition to feel intellectually superior to your peers instead of using it to become internally stronger. You confuse philosophical style with philosophical substance, wearing the aesthetic of wisdom while remaining a slave to your own impulses. The diagnostic protocol. To stop performing and start building, you must use the problem to philosophy match. You do not pick a philosophy because it sounds cool. You pick it because it fixes your specific broken code. If your primary problem is overreaction and emotional hijacking, you begin your build with Stoicism. If your primary problem is hesitation, cowardice, or endless procrastination, you lean heavily into Bushido and the mechanics of decisive action. If your primary problem is constant distraction and a total inability to focus, you use Zen to train your attention. If your primary problem is over-control, burnout, and exhausting yourself against immovable obstacles, you use Taoism to relearn leverage. If your primary problem is emptiness, nihilism, and a lack of drive, you use Existentialism to choose your meaning. You can detect your needs quickly by asking yourself a few brutal questions. What exact pattern keeps repeating in your life under pressure? Which specific situations make your current philosophy completely disappear? What kind of challenge do you handle worst out of pain, uncertainty, conflict, or meaninglessness? Your honest answers to these questions will tell you exactly which library you need to raid first. Your correction protocol is simple: library first, loyalty later. Pick one primary tradition that directly attacks your main weakness. Pick one secondary tradition that complements it. Then, translate one single principle from each of those libraries into a visible, physical behavior this week. Do not ask which philosophy is objectively best. Ask which one solves the bleeding problem right in front of you. Keep each tradition tied to a specific job, not a vague vibe. If you cannot explain exactly how a principle changes your physical behavior, you do not own it yet. System failures and patches. As you begin extracting from these libraries, your ego will try to sabotage the installation. You must anticipate these failures and patch them immediately. You might turn a philosophy into an identity badge, using it to signal your superiority to other men while your private life remains a disaster. Fix this by asking what practical, uncomfortable problem this philosophy is actually solving in your life today. If it is not fixing a flaw, it is just a costume. You might mix traditions carelessly, throwing Stoic detachment and Taoist yielding into a blender until you have a muddy excuse for total passivity. Fix this by assigning each tradition one clear, specific job before you ever attempt to combine it with another. You might collect too many libraries at once, reading 10 different books and trying to run 50 different principles simultaneously. Fix this by choosing one primary source and one secondary source only. You build a foundation with a few massive stones, not 1,000 pebbles. You might admire famous names instead of learning actual mechanisms, quoting emperors and warriors without understanding the cognitive gears turning beneath their words. Fix this by rewriting every borrowed quote into your own blunt rule of conduct. Strip away the poetry and keep the instruction. You might reject powerful traditions because of their packaging or their cultural stereotypes, ignoring Eastern thought because it sounds too soft, or Western thought because it sounds too rigid. Fix this by evaluating principles strictly by their performance under pressure, not by their branding. The evolution of your operating system. When you apply this modular approach, your internal architecture evolves through 3 distinct tiers of capability. At the good level, you finally stop feeling overwhelmed by the scattered philosophy content on the internet. You can clearly name what each major tradition is mainly good for. You begin separating the actual utility of a concept from its aesthetic style. You stop being a passive consumer of quotes and start becoming an active evaluator of tools. At the excellent level, you can instantly match common life problems to the exact right source library. You stop copying random rules that do not fit your specific pressure points. You begin assembling a coherent architecture instead of just hoarding inspiration. When a crisis hits, you do not panic. You simply access the correct library and run the required code. At the best level, you build a flexible, cross-cultural source base for your personal operating system. You can explain exactly why a given principle belongs in your system and what structural load it carries. You completely stop following philosophers and you start extracting code from them. You become the sovereign engineer of your own mind, capable of pulling leverage from any tradition on Earth without ever losing your own center of gravity. Good source material is absolutely critical, but it is not enough to save you. You now know where the strongest code in human history is stored, and you know how to extract it. But the next massive threat to your system is overload through abundance. If you try to install too much of this code at once, you will build nothing but a bloated, paralyzed machine. You cannot run every good idea you find. You must now face the brutal work of elimination. You must choose the very few rules that can actually carry the entire weight of your life. But how do you know which principles will hold firm and which ones will shatter into dust the moment the floor drops out beneath you? Chapter 3, Kernel Rules. You are lying to yourself about what you actually stand for. You probably have a long list of values you can recite on command. You believe in honesty, hard work, discipline, and respect. You have read the right books, and you know the right words to say when someone asks you about your philosophy of life. But there is a massive difference between a value you admire and a rule you actually obey. When the pressure is off, your values look magnificent, but the moment you are insulted, delayed, exhausted, or threatened, those beautiful values evaporate into thin air. You abandon your honesty to avoid an uncomfortable conversation. You abandon your discipline the second your mood drops. You abandon your respect the moment someone challenges your ego. This happens because you do not understand the fundamental architecture of a working system. You have spent your life installing decorative beliefs, but you have neglected the core. This chapter will force you to strip away the decorations and build the central engine of your operating system. You will slowly discover what a kernel actually is, why your current one is failing, and how to select the exact non-negotiable rules that will finally carry the weight of your life. The illusion of decorative beliefs. Most men do not lack principles. They lack load-bearing principles. The real question is not whether you have values, but whether those values survive pain, delay, insult, and uncertainty. If your principles vanish under pressure, then the pressure is simply exposing theater, not truth. You have been performing a character. You are not inconsistent because life is complicated. You are inconsistent because your internal kernel is weak. You cannot build a disciplined, formidable life on decorative beliefs that only function when you are rested, calm, admired, and winning. Hard conditions do not ruin your philosophy. They reveal it. This is the ultimate identity-level confrontation. You must stop blaming your environment for your lack of consistency. If a bad day at work makes you abandon your standards were never real. If a rude comment from a stranger ruins your focus was a fragile illusion. The loser keeps his broad ideals vague, so he never actually has to test them. He calls himself a Stoic, but explodes in traffic. He calls himself a warrior, but folds when his boss raises his voice. The winner reduces his code to a few absolute rules he can obey in the middle of total chaos. Winners choose rigid standards. Losers choose flattering self-descriptions. The architecture of the core. In computer engineering, the kernel is the foundational layer of an operating system. It handles the most critical operations. It must be stable, it must be simple, and it must be entirely load-bearing. If the kernel crashes, the entire machine dies. Your personal philosophy requires the exact same architecture. Kernel rules are the few non-negotiable principles that govern your responses across every single context of your life. They are not goals. They are not moods. They are not identity slogans you put in your social media bio. They are behavioral absolutes. Fewer, clearer principles will always beat longer, softer lists. If you have 20 core values, you have 0 core values. You cannot hold 20 variables in your mind when your heart rate spikes and someone is screaming in your face. You need 3 to 5 rules that act as an unbreakable floor. To find these rules, you must answer 3 brutal questions. First, what must you absolutely control? Second, what must you completely accept? Third, what are you actually willing to suffer for? Your answers to these questions form the foundation of your kernel. This introduces a concept you must adopt immediately, which is the Stockdale standard. A kernel rule must survive the worst realistic conditions of your life. It must hold when you are broke, when you are tired, when you are disrespected, and when you are completely alone. If a principle only works when the sun is shining and everyone is clapping for you, it is an app, not a kernel. It is optional software. Stress reveals architecture, and your kernel must be built to withstand the maximum expected stress of your actual reality. The crucible of ordinary chaos. You must examine what this looks like in the daily trenches of your life. Consider a career scenario involving a direct threat to your status. You are passed over for a promotion, criticized unfairly by leadership, or underestimated by your peers. A weak kernel immediately leads to deep resentment or performance theater. You start complaining behind closed doors, or you start working frantically just to prove them wrong, letting their judgment dictate your energy. A strong kernel redirects you instantly to your own effort, your own skill, and your own self-command. You do not bleed energy into resentment because your kernel rule dictates that you only value what you control. Look at a relationship scenario where you must choose between truth and comfort. You feel rising tension with your partner, and you desperately want to dodge an honest conversation. A weak kernel chooses peacekeeping. You swallow your words, you smile, and you let hidden resentment build like a poison in the foundation of your home. A strong kernel chooses calm truth and clear boundaries. You initiate the hard conversation without aggression because your kernel rule dictates that honesty is mandatory regardless of the immediate friction it causes. Observe a money scenario where fear collides with discipline. A sudden financial setback tempts you to panic and make short-term, destructive decisions. A weak kernel chases immediate emotional relief. You sell when you should hold, you quit when you should build, or you numb the panic with a distraction. A strong kernel follows the established process even when your mood is screaming at you to abandon ship. You execute the math, not the emotion. Finally, consider a self-respect scenario driven by validation dependence. You are in a room full of people, and you feel the urge to shape your behavior around their admiration, their likes, or their approval. A weak kernel bends under the social weather. You laugh at jokes you do not find funny. You agree with opinions you despise, and you betray your own standards to avoid rejection. A strong kernel stays perfectly aligned when nobody is watching, and it stays perfectly aligned when everybody is judging. You remain solid because your kernel rule dictates that your self-respect is not up for public vote. Mapping your personal collapses. You cannot choose strong principles if you do not know exactly where you break. You must map your failure modes. People rarely fail randomly. They fail in highly predictable patterns. You must identify your specific crash map before you can write the code to fix it. There are 5 primary crashes you must look for. The anger crash happens when you overreact. The second you are challenged, using volume to compensate for a lack of internal control. The fear crash happens when you stall and paralyze yourself the moment outcomes feel uncertain. The ego crash happens when you protect your image instead of acknowledging the truth. The validation crash happens when you betray your own standards simply to avoid a moment of social friction. The drift crash happens when you lose all direction and discipline the second external pressure is removed. To detect your specific pattern, you must review your last 5 major failures. Look at your last 5 overreactions, hesitations, or bad decisions. Identify the exact emotional trigger that started the cascade. Identify the hidden belief that justified your reaction. Then, identify the specific rule that would have prevented the crash entirely. Once you have this data, you execute the correction protocol and build your minimum viable operating system. You will choose only 3 to 5 kernel rules. You will write each rule in plain, brutal language. You will make each rule entirely behavioral and testable. You will tie each rule directly to one of your recurring failure modes. If your main failure mode is the anger crash, your kernel rule might be that you never raise your voice in a disagreement. If your main failure mode is the fear crash, your kernel rule might be that you take action within 60 seconds of feeling hesitation. The ultimate trick here is the 10-second test. If a rule cannot guide your physical action within 10 seconds of a crisis, you must rewrite it. If a rule sounds incredibly noble but feels entirely fake to your actual life, you must cut it. If a rule depends on you being in a good mood to execute it, it is not a kernel rule. It is a fantasy. The traps of ego and imitation. As you attempt to write these rules, you will encounter several traps designed to keep you weak. You might choose way too many principles, creating a massive list of 30 values that you could never possibly remember under fire. Fix this by forcing yourself to cut the list until only the absolute non-negotiables remain. If everything is important, nothing is important. You might choose vague, impressive-sounding values like integrity or excellence. These words mean nothing when your heart is pounding. Fix this by rewriting each vague value as a visible, physical behavior under pressure. Excellence is not a kernel rule. Never submitting a project without reviewing it 3 times is a kernel rule. You might copy another man's code because it sounds strong on a podcast or in a book. You adopt the rules of a billionaire or a special forces operator, completely ignoring the fact that your daily life looks nothing like theirs. Fix this by stress testing every single rule against your own specific life conditions. Your kernel is not built to impress strangers on the internet. It is built to stop your most expensive forms of self-sabotage. You might confuse goals with principles. You might write down that you will make $1 million or get in perfect shape. Those are outcomes, not operating rules. Fix this by asking whether the rule still matters when the goal completely changes. A kernel rule dictates how you pursue the goal, not the goal itself. You might choose rules that flatter your ego instead of correcting your actual weakness. You might write a rule about being a lone wolf because you think it sounds tough, when your actual failure mode is that you are terrified of vulnerability and connection. Fix this by matching every single rule to a documented crash pattern from your past. Your rules must attack your flaws, not stroke your vanity. The evolution of the sovereign mind. When you successfully install these kernel rules, your life will upgrade through 3 distinct tiers of power. At the good level, you can finally state clearly what you actually stand for. You reduce the massive inner contradiction in your ordinary, daily decisions. You stop pretending that all values matter equally, and you start operating with a clear hierarchy of importance. You no longer wake up wondering what kind of man you are going to be today. At the excellent level, you make significantly cleaner choices in the middle of conflict, extreme pressure, and total uncertainty. You catch your main failure modes earlier and earlier. You feel the anger crash coming, and your kernel rule intercepts it before you open your mouth. Your behavior becomes ruthlessly consistent across your career, your money management, and your relationships. People start to notice that you no longer bend in the wind. At the best level, you operate entirely from a load-bearing personal kernel. Your principles survive your worst moods, the heaviest social pressure, and the most painful setbacks imaginable. You become a man whose daily conduct makes his internal code completely visible to the world. You do not have to tell people what your philosophy is, because they can see it in the way you walk into a room, the way you handle an insult, and the way you execute your duties when nobody is watching. You now have the core architecture. You have selected the few rules that will govern your existence. But knowing the rules and executing the rules are 2 entirely different things. Strong principles are still not enough if a sudden spike of adrenaline can override them in 3 seconds. You can memorize your kernel rules perfectly and still break every single one of them when someone screams in your face or when a massive wave of anxiety hits your chest. The next threat is not philosophical confusion. The next threat is biological hijacking. To protect the kernel, you must build a barrier that catches the surge before it burns down your architecture. You are about to learn how to process the fire without letting it burn you alive. Chapter 4: Emotional Firewall. You have been sold a catastrophic lie about what it means to be a strong man. You have been told that strength means feeling absolutely nothing. You watch videos of Stoic icons, you read quotes about unshakable warriors, and you convince yourself that the ultimate goal of human development is to become a stone. You think that if you can just suppress your anger, bury your anxiety, and ignore your frustration, you will finally achieve mastery. This is the emotion lie, and it is destroying your life from the inside out. This chapter will dismantle the fake toughness you have been practicing and replace it with a mechanism that actually works under pressure. You will slowly discover how to catch the invisible surges that hijack your brain, and you will learn the exact strategy required to process chaos without becoming its puppet. By the end of this section, you will understand why your attempts to be stoic are actually making you incredibly fragile, and you will possess the blueprint for a system that separates your feelings from your physical actions. The deception of the numb mind. When you equate strength with numbness, you create a highly volatile internal environment. You build a man who looks perfectly calm on the outside until he suddenly explodes, shuts down entirely, or goes completely numb to the world around him. Numbness is not control. Numbness is delayed chaos. When you suppress an emotion, you do not destroy it. You simply store it in your nervous system, where it ferments into resentment, bitterness, and sudden outbursts of rage over completely irrelevant inconveniences. This is an identity-level confrontation that you can no longer avoid. If one single emotion can rewrite your entire code of conduct in a matter of seconds, your principles are not actually in charge. You are not the author of your life. You are a hostage to your own biology. You do not need less feeling. You need significantly better processing. The loser obeys the emotional surge the second it hits his chest. He feels anger, and he immediately attacks. He feels fear, and he immediately retreats. The winner feels the exact same surge, but he interrogates it before he moves a single muscle. The real stakes of this misunderstanding are devastating. Career damage rarely comes from a lack of technical skill. It comes from impulsive speech, ego-driven reactions, and the inability to handle professional friction without taking it personally. Relationship damage does not come from a lack of love. It comes from deep defensiveness, punishing silence, and the emotional avoidance you disguise as keeping the peace. Self-respect damage comes from looking in the mirror and knowing that you are calling your emotional suppression discipline, when in reality, you are just terrified of your own internal state. The architecture of the filter. To stop this cycle of suppression and explosion, you must build a barrier. You need a filtering system that sits directly between your emotional input and your behavioral output. This is the emotional firewall. The firewall does not erase your feelings. It does not make you a robot. It simply prevents the biological hijacking of your decision-making process. A strong firewall protects your objective judgment without killing your emotional intelligence. It allows you to feel the fire without letting the fire burn down your house. Emotions are not commands from the universe. They are simply data. They are rapid internal signals generated by your past judgments, your memories, your bodily states, and your perceived threats. They are incredibly useful indicators, but they are not sovereign rulers. This is where the ancient source libraries become highly practical. Stoic thought is valuable here not because it kills emotion, but because it trains your judgment about the emotion. Zen contributes by drastically reducing the lag time between the physical sensation and your conscious awareness of it. Together, they create a three-stage processing pipeline. You detect the feeling, you evaluate the story behind it, and you decide on the action. You must understand the absolute difference between suppression and processing. Suppression hides the feeling and leaves the corrupted code alive. You grit your teeth, you force a smile, and you pretend you are not angry, but the judgment that caused the anger remains completely untouched. Processing surfaces the feeling, holds it up to the light, and examines the code beneath it. One method creates delayed damage and eventual collapse. The other method creates usable intelligence and immediate clarity. The crucible of daily friction. You must see how this firewall operates in the brutal reality of your daily life. Consider a story-led scenario involving a sudden hit in a professional meeting. Someone directly challenges your competence in front of your peers. Your heart rate spikes, your face flushes, and your first biological surge tells you to attack their credibility, defend your ego loudly, or withdraw into a sulking silence. Without a firewall, you obey the surge and damage your reputation. With the firewall active, you slow the chain reaction long enough to access accurate judgment. You feel the heat in your chest, you recognize the ego threat, and you respond to the actual data of their challenge rather than the emotional tone of their delivery. Look at a relationship scenario involving criticism at home. A partner points out a failure or a broken promise, and your chest tightens instantly. Without a firewall, you immediately counterattack. You bring up something they did wrong last month, you explain away your failure with a dozen excuses, or you shut down completely and walk out of the room. You let the emotion dictate the strategy. With a firewall, you separate their frustrated tone from the objective truth of their statement. You process the sting of the criticism, you own what is actually yours, and you answer the real issue without escalating the war. Observe a money and status scenario triggered by sudden envy. You see another man winning. You see his success, his freedom, or his recognition, and you feel instantly threatened and behind in life. Without a firewall, that raw envy rots into contempt or self-pity. You tell yourself he got lucky, or you tell yourself you are a failure. With a firewall, the feeling is caught and decoded. The envy becomes highly specific data about your own dormant ambitions, your own unkept promises, and your own insecurities. You use the emotion to locate your own weak points instead of using it to hate a stranger. The mechanics of the override. To install this firewall, you must master the mechanics of the override. The first tool is the 90-second scan. When the pressure hits and the emotion spikes, you must ask yourself 4 sequential questions. What am I feeling right now in my physical body? What specific story am I telling myself about this situation? What objective fact do I actually know to be true? What response serves my kernel rules? You run this scan while the adrenaline is pumping, forcing your logical brain to engage while your emotional brain is screaming. The second tool is the signal, story, standard method. The signal is the raw, physical feeling without any of the drama attached to it. It is just heat in the chest, tension in the jaw, or a sinking feeling in the stomach. The story is the wild interpretation your ego is amplifying it with, telling you that you are being disrespected or that the world is ending. The standard is the kernel rule you have already chosen to govern your next move. You separate the signal from the story, and you execute the standard. Your immediate correction protocol requires physical discipline. You must pause your mouth before your mind catches up. You drop your attention out of your racing thoughts and into your physical body to drastically reduce your processing speed. You label the emotion precisely instead of vaguely. You do not say you are upset. You say you are experiencing acute embarrassment. You ask what specific judgment is making the emotion spike. Then, you choose only the very next action, not the entire emotional future of the relationship or the career. The tricks to maintaining this firewall are simple but difficult to execute. Name the emotion, and it immediately weakens its grip on your nervous system. Breathe lower into your stomach and slower through your nose before you speak a single word. Delay your reaction, but never delay your responsibility. Remember that strong men feel deeply, but they choose their actions incredibly carefully. The traps of fake composure. As you build this firewall, your ego will attempt to bypass it using several predictable traps. You must anticipate these failures and correct them in real time. You might suppress your emotion and call it discipline, pushing the anger down into your stomach and pretending you are a master of Stoicism. Fix this by forcing yourself to name the exact feeling in your mind before you decide what to do. Acknowledging the fire is the only way to contain it. You might overanalyze the emotion until you completely freeze, spending hours journaling about your feelings while the actual problem burns to the ground. Fix this by giving yourself a strict 2-minute window to evaluate the emotion before taking the clearest, most principled next step. The firewall is meant to pause the reaction, not paralyze the execution. You might assume that every strong feeling you experience is an objective truth, believing that because you feel disrespected, disrespect must have actually occurred. Fix this by ruthlessly separating the biological signal from the story attached to it. Your feelings are valid experiences, but they are terrible judges of reality. You might avoid necessary conflict just to stay calm, using your new emotional control as an excuse to never have hard conversations. Fix this by remembering that processing emotion is supposed to improve your action, not replace your action. Calm cowardice is still cowardice. You might use Stoicism as a heavy armor against any form of vulnerability, refusing to connect with the people you love because you are terrified of losing your rigid composure. Fix this by telling the truth cleanly and directly, instead of pretending you are completely unaffected by the people who matter to you. The evolution of internal command. When you successfully maintain this firewall, your internal command evolves through 3 distinct tiers of capability. At the good level, you begin to notice your emotional triggers significantly sooner. You feel the heat rising in your neck, and you recognize the pattern before you open your mouth. You drastically reduce your impulsive reactions in low-stakes situations, like traffic or minor inconveniences. You finally stop confusing emotional numbness with actual strength, and you start respecting the data your body is giving you. At the excellent level, you handle interpersonal conflict with terrifying accuracy and almost zero ego. You recover incredibly fast from emotional hits that used to ruin your entire week. You process the insult, extract the lesson, and move on in a matter of minutes. The people around you begin to deeply trust your steadiness under pressure. They realize that you are no longer a volatile variable in their lives, but a stable pillar they can rely on when the environment gets chaotic. At the best level, your emotions become pure intelligence instead of constant sabotage. You can feel anger, fear, and joy fully and completely without ever losing your command over your physical actions. Your internal state completely stops dictating your external conduct. You become a man who can walk through a storm of disrespect, temptation, and chaos with a quiet mind and a steady hand. You are no longer fighting your emotions. You are simply governing them. Processing your emotions cleanly buys you the most valuable asset in the world during a crisis, which is time. It gives you the critical seconds you need to stop a fatal reaction. But buying time alone is not enough to win the war. If you pause the reaction but you do not know exactly what to do next, the hesitation will kill you. If you cannot sort through the chaos of reality at high speed, the emotion will simply sneak back into the driver's seat the moment your willpower fades. You have built the barrier to stop the surge. Now you need an engine that runs faster than the panic. Chapter 5. Decision Engine. You think you make bad decisions because you lack intelligence. You think you blow up in arguments, panic during financial setbacks, or freeze during confrontations because you are fundamentally flawed. But intelligence has absolutely nothing to do with it. Your worst decisions do not happen because you are stupid. They happen because you are slow. Under extreme pressure, you do not rise to the level of your noble intentions. You fall to the level of your operating speed. When a crisis hits, your emotional systems react in milliseconds. Your deliberate reasoning takes much longer to boot up. If you do not have a mechanism to bridge that gap, emotion wins the race every single time. This chapter will expose the brutal reality of cognitive bottlenecks and show you exactly how to build a framework that runs faster than panic, faster than ego, and faster than social pressure. You will learn how to sort reality quickly, identify what is in your control, and act without getting trapped in emotional static. By the time you finish this section, you will possess a mental machine designed to execute your philosophy in real time. The speed of collapse. When emotion moves faster than judgment, your default code takes over and ruins your life. You do not blow up, fold, or panic because you lack a desire to be better. You break because the pressure of the moment completely outruns your internal process. You have a philosophy that works perfectly in a quiet room while you are drinking coffee and writing in a journal. But if your philosophy only works in quiet rooms, it does not work at all. You are not as disciplined as your calmest self-image. Real character shows up in compressed time. When the clock is ticking, when the boss is yelling, when the bank account is draining, your beautiful theories evaporate. This is the ultimate identity-level confrontation. You must stop pretending that your intentions matter when your execution is sloppy. The world does not care what you meant to do. The world only registers what you actually did. This exposes the stark contrast between a winner and a loser in the arena of high-stakes action. Winners simplify under pressure. Losers dramatize under pressure. Winners decide from pre-established principles. Losers decide from biological surges. A loser feels the heat of a moment, gets overwhelmed by the noise, and lashes out blindly just to relieve the internal tension. A winner feels the exact same heat, but he runs it through a structured system that instantly narrows his options down to the single most effective move. The architecture of immediate action. To beat the biological surge, you cannot rely on endless reflection. You need a cognitive machine that runs faster than your fear. You need a decision engine. This is the internal system that sorts chaotic pressure into clean action. Good decisions require a repeatable architecture, not raw willpower. Decision quality improves massively when your interpretation of reality is structured before you ever take action. You must stop trying to invent morality on the fly and start relying on a pre-built sorting algorithm. The core model of this engine is a three-step sequence: sort, strip, strike. First, you sort the elements of the crisis. Second, you strip away the useless noise. Third, you strike with a principled action. To sort effectively, you must use the dichotomy of control as a rapid sorting algorithm. You divide reality into three categories. Control means direct command over your thoughts, your words, your choices, and your effort. Influence means partial leverage through preparation, persuasion, or timing. No control means reality. You must simply factor in without wasting a single ounce of force against it. This engine relies heavily on preloaded responses. Human beings make vastly better decisions in calm conditions than they do in chaos. Therefore, part of wise living is deciding in advance exactly how you will handle predictable pressures. You do not wait until an insult, a temptation, or a fear hits to invent your values. You preload your responses. You decide today what you will do tomorrow when someone disrespects you. You decide today what you will do next week when a project fails. This turns philosophy from passive reflection into active readiness. It is less like reading a textbook and more like drilling for combat. Rehearsed clarity will always beat improvised morality. The crucible of compressed time. You must see how this engine operates when the clock is ticking and the stakes are real. Imagine a sudden career crisis where pressure comes from above. Your manager changes the target at the last minute and demands immediate results. Without a decision engine, you spiral into blame, panic, or overpromising. You waste precious time complaining about the unfairness of the situation, or you agree to an impossible deadline just to relieve the social pressure. With a decision engine, you instantly sort what can still be done. You strip out the ego injury of being treated unfairly, and you strike with clean professional action. You state exactly what is possible, you allocate your effort, and you execute without emotional drag. Consider a relationship scenario where conflict erupts in real time. A hard conversation turns hostile and deeply personal. Without a decision engine, you defend your image instead of solving the issue. You raise your voice, you bring up past grievances, and you fight to win the argument rather than fix the rupture. With a decision engine, you strip out the ego. You recognize that their anger is in the no-control bucket, but your tone of voice is in the direct control bucket. You respond to the actual problem with steady composure. Look at a money scenario driven by fear-based action. A massive financial setback makes you want to make an impulsive move for instant relief. You want to sell everything, quit the project, or numb the pain with a distraction. Without a decision engine, short-term fear becomes long-term financial damage. With a decision engine, you narrow your focus to what creates real leverage. You sort the lost capital into the no-control bucket, and you strike by executing the next logical step in your recovery plan, completely ignoring the panic in your chest. Observe a social scenario involving respect and status triggers. Someone disrespects you in public, and your body wants speed, volume, and revenge. Without a framework, you confuse loud reaction with actual strength. You escalate the situation to protect a fragile ego. With a framework, you separate what preserves your dignity from what merely performs it for an audience. You strip away the fantasy of looking like a tough guy, and you strike with a cold, measured response that ends the interaction without compromising your kernel rules. The mechanics of the override. To install this engine, you must master a few specific tools. The first is the three-bucket sort. When chaos hits, you mentally place every element of the problem into one of three buckets. Bucket 1 is direct control. Bucket 2 is influence. Bucket 3 is absolute zero control. You immediately discard bucket 3. You acknowledge it exists, but you withdraw all emotional energy from it. You focus your strategic planning on bucket 2, and you pour all of your aggressive execution into bucket 1. The second tool is the 10-scenario decision tree. You must sit down in a calm environment and list your 10 most common high-pressure situations. These are the recurring moments where you typically fail. You define the specific kernel rule that governs each one. Then, you write down the first useful action for each scenario. You rehearse this mental map until the rule feels entirely familiar under pressure. You are building a neural pathway that your brain can travel down automatically when the adrenaline hits. Your immediate correction protocol is to execute the sort, strip, strike sequence in under 30 seconds. Ask what part of this is actually yours to command. Remove the parts driven by ego, fear, image, or fantasy. Choose the smallest principled action that moves the situation forward. If you feel urgency, reduce the problem before you solve it. If you feel insulted, separate respect from ego performance. If you feel overwhelmed, decide only the very next move. If you feel completely stuck, ask what action would still make sense tomorrow morning when the emotion has faded. You must adopt a micro rule to make this work. Slow the mouth, speed the sort. Speak significantly less while classification is still happening in your mind. Name the category before naming the solution. Do not let your tongue outrun your framework. Silence is a weapon you use to buy time for your decision engine to boot up. Let the other person talk, let the chaos swirl, and keep your mouth shut until the sorting algorithm has produced a clean target. System failures and patches. As you run this engine in the real world, you will encounter predictable system failures. Your ego will try to hijack the framework. You must anticipate these bugs and patch them immediately. You might treat control as a fake binary, believing you either control everything or you control absolutely nothing. This leads to either exhausting micromanagement or total passive surrender. Fix this by heavily utilizing the middle category of influence so you stop missing real leverage. You cannot control a client's decision, but you can heavily influence it through preparation and competence. You might overthink the framework and miss the moment entirely. You stand there running the sorting algorithm over and over again while the house burns down. Fix this by deciding only the next useful action, not the perfect total plan. The engine is designed for speed, not perfection. A good decision executed immediately is infinitely better than a perfect decision executed 10 minutes too late. You might act tough when you are really just protecting your ego. You use the language of decisiveness to mask the fact that you are throwing a tantrum. Fix this by brutally asking yourself whether your chosen action serves your core principles or your public image. If it only serves your image, it is a corrupted decision. You might prepare absolutely nothing in advance and rely on your mood to save you. You read this chapter, nod your head, and then fail to build your 10-scenario decision tree. Fix this by doing the actual work before the pressure ever arrives. An engine cannot run if you refuse to build the parts. You might ignore long-term consequences in the name of being decisive. You strike quickly, but you strike blindly, creating a massive mess that you have to clean up later. Fix this by testing every single rapid action against your kernel rules and your ultimate goals. Speed without direction is just a faster car crash. The evolution of high-speed judgment. When you successfully run this engine, your judgment evolves through 3 distinct tiers of power. At the good level, you make significantly fewer sloppy decisions in ordinary stress. You recover from confusion faster. You begin separating what actually matters from what only feels loud. You stop treating every minor inconvenience like a life or death crisis, and you start conserving your energy for the battles that actually require force. At the excellent level, you stay incredibly clear in conflict, uncertainty, and social pressure. You waste zero energy on uncontrollable noise. Your actions become ruthlessly consistent with your standards, regardless of the environment. People start coming to you in a crisis because they recognize that your mind operates at a different speed than theirs. You become an anchor of stability in a room full of panic. At the best level, you develop fast, clean judgment under extreme pressure. You become known for calm decisiveness instead of emotional drama. Your philosophy starts running live, not just conceptually. You become the man who sorts the chaos, strips the noise, and strikes the target while everyone else is still trying to figure out what happened. Your internal architecture becomes a physical reality. But a framework can still fail if it lives only in your thoughts. You can understand this entire process, you can memorize the sorting algorithm, you can build the decision tree, and you can still completely collapse in reality. The gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it under fire is a graveyard of good intentions. To cross that gap, the system must be driven deep into your nervous system, not just written in your notes. You are about to discover the exact mechanism that turns a fragile concept into an unbreakable reflex. Chapter 6, Training Loop. You are currently suffering from the most dangerous illusion in the modern world. You believe that knowing what is right is the exact same thing as doing what is right. You read a book, you highlight a profound sentence, you feel a massive surge of inspiration, and you genuinely believe that you have changed. But you have not changed at all. Knowing is incredibly cheap. You can perfectly explain a principle of discipline at breakfast and completely betray that exact same principle by lunch. Most self-improvement fails because the mere intake of information feels exactly like real progress. But exposure only builds familiarity. It does not build reliability. This chapter will destroy the gap between what you know and what you actually do. You will stop treating philosophy like a reading hobby and start treating it like a martial discipline. You will learn exactly how to convert abstract principles into automatic, physical responses. By the time you finish this section, you will understand why your current standards are completely theatrical, and you will possess the exact mechanism required to drive your philosophy deep into your nervous system. The illusion of low-pressure wisdom. This is an identity-level confrontation that you must face immediately. If you only perform your wisdom in low-pressure environments, you do not actually own that wisdom. Your standards are only as real as your habits under extreme friction. A man who never trains for surprise is entirely ruled by surprise. When the hit comes, you will not have time to remember the quote you highlighted. You will only have time to execute the reflex you have trained. This exposes the brutal contrast between a winner and a loser in the arena of execution. Winners rehearse reality before life ever tests them. Losers wait for the pressure to hit, completely collapse, and then call their failure bad luck. Winners drill their principles into their muscles. Losers simply admire their principles from a distance. A loser hopes that inspiration will magically appear when the crisis hits. A winner knows that inspiration is a myth and relies entirely on the cold, hard mechanics of repetition. The architecture of installation. To bridge the gap between theory and execution, you must build a training loop. The training loop is a 4-part mechanism: drill, deploy, review, refine. Repetition under conditions that closely resemble real stress is the only way to build accessible behavior. You cannot read your way into discipline. You must drill your way into it. The training loop converts fragile ideas into usable, automatic patterns. It completely replaces the need for one-time bursts of motivation with the undeniable power of compounding repetition. The installation path takes exactly 5 weeks. Week 1 is dedicated entirely to awareness drills. You simply track your failures without trying to fix them. Week 2 introduces micro-adversity practice. You intentionally create tiny moments of friction to test your baseline reactions. Week 3 escalates to controlled stress exposure. You put yourself in slightly larger, uncomfortable situations to see if your kernel rules hold. Week 4 is real-world deployment. You take the system into your actual career and relationships. Week 5 is the debug and repeat phase, where you analyze the data and tighten the code. The core engine of this loop is deliberate discomfort. Deliberate discomfort is chosen friction used specifically to reveal weak code. You voluntarily expose yourself to manageable challenges to see exactly where your architecture breaks. This is not about punishing yourself. This is about diagnosing yourself. This is the exact logic used by elite performers throughout history. They did not rely on good vibes. They used repeated exposure and brutal reflection to drastically reduce the element of surprise. The crucible of rehearsal. You must see how this training loop operates in the ordinary trenches of your life. Consider a career scenario where you must practice composure before it is actually needed. You know a hard meeting is coming. Instead of waiting for the meeting to happen and hoping you stay calm, you rehearse exactly how you will respond to criticism. You practice giving concise, unemotional answers under mild pressure instead of rambling when the moment arrives. You stop treating ordinary work friction as an annoyance and start treating it as live training for your emotional firewall. Look at a relationship scenario where you must rehearse truthful calm. You do not wait for an explosive conflict to practice honesty. You practice pausing before reacting during incredibly small disagreements. You rehearse clean, direct honesty when the stakes are low, so the neural pathway is already built when the stakes are high. You use the review phase after every single conversation to refine your tone, your timing, and your clarity. Observe a money scenario where you are training against impulse. You intentionally create small, controlled situations where you absolutely refuse to obey short-term urges. You observe exactly how the discomfort of denying yourself distorts your judgment. You learn through physical repetition that the urge to panic or spend passes significantly faster than your old code suggests. Finally, consider a personal discipline scenario where you must close the gap between your plan and your action. You notice exactly how quickly your mood tries to renegotiate your standards the second you feel tired. You train against this by keeping incredibly small promises under low glamour conditions. You make the consistency of the action infinitely more important than the intensity of the action. The mechanics of the drill. To run this loop effectively, you must master 2 specific tools. The first is the after-action review. After every significant interaction, you must ask yourself 4 questions. What exactly happened? What did I physically feel? Which kernel rule failed or held? What exact adjustment will I make next time? You run this review coldly, like an engineer looking at a broken machine, completely devoid of shame or self-pity. The second tool is the micro-adversity drill. You must practice calm speech under minor frustration. When you are stuck in traffic or dealing with an incompetent system, you practice lowering your voice and slowing your breath. You practice choosing your standards over your comfort in incredibly low-stakes situations. You practice brief exposure to uncertainty without immediately reaching for your phone or a distraction to escape the feeling. Your correction protocol is to train the weakest link first. Identify your most frequent crash pattern from the previous chapters. Create one highly repeatable drill tied directly to that specific pattern. Deploy that drill several times a week. Review the results and tighten the drill. If your weakest link is anger, your drill is to pause for 3 seconds before responding to any minor annoyance. The tricks to maintaining this loop are simple. Train small and train often. Review the failure the exact same day while the memory is still sharp and the sting is still real. Do not confuse suffering with progress. Staring at a wall and being miserable is not training. Executing a specific behavior under friction is training. Repetition always beats intensity. You must adopt a micro rule to make this work. No unreviewed failure. Every single crash contains vital code that you need to inspect. Shame is a completely useless emotion because it wastes the data. When you feel shame, you hide from the failure. When you run a review, you turn the pain of the failure into permanent architecture. System failures and patches. As you run this training loop, your ego will attempt to sabotage the repetition. You must anticipate these bugs and patch them immediately. You might train inconsistently and wonder why absolutely nothing is sticking to your behavior. You do a drill once, feel good about it, and then forget about it for 3 weeks. Fix this by attaching one specific drill to an existing daily routine. Tie the drill to your commute, your arrival at the office, or your evening shutdown. You might choose challenges that are way too big, way too early. You try to fix your entire life in one weekend. You completely break under the massive pressure, and you quit. Fix this by scaling the discomfort incredibly gradually so you train the muscle without snapping the bone. You might shame yourself after a failure and completely abandon the training loop. You blow up in an argument, you feel like a hypocrite, and you decide the system does not work. Fix this by treating every single failure as debug data, not a final verdict on your identity. The machine broke. Fix the machine. Do not cry over the machine. You might stay entirely in theory and actively avoid live situations. You journal endlessly about your drills, but you never actually test them in a real conversation. Fix this by forcing the drills into your career, your relationships, and your money pressure as soon as possible. A sword that never strikes armor is just a toy. You might stop training the second you feel early progress. You string together 3 good days, you feel a surge of confidence, and you completely abandon the loop. Fix this by scheduling weekly stress tests so the system keeps deepening. The moment you think you have mastered the code is the exact moment the code begins to rot. The evolution of automatic command. When you successfully run this training loop, your execution evolves through 3 distinct tiers of power. At the good level, you become significantly more aware of your patterns in real time. You start closing the massive gap between what you know and what you actually do. Your standards begin showing up in smaller stress moments. You catch the minor annoyances before they escalate, and you start building a quiet confidence based on actual physical evidence rather than motivational self-talk. At the excellent level, you react significantly less blindly in the middle of conflict, temptation, and deep uncertainty. You build real confidence because you have a track record of surviving the drills. Your recovery time after mistakes becomes incredibly fast and exceptionally clean. You no longer spiral into days of regret. You simply run the review, patch the code, and execute the next move. At the best level, your philosophy becomes instantly accessible under extreme pressure. Composure, honesty, and discipline begin to feel entirely automatic. You no longer have to force yourself to be strong. The strength is simply the default output of the trained machine. You become the kind of man who can be completely trusted by himself. Training creates massive momentum, and momentum feels incredible. But momentum has a dark side. If left unchecked, momentum can easily turn into rigid, brittle dogma. The next threat to your operating system is stale code, unnoticed drift, and hidden bugs that accumulate over time. What worked perfectly for you in version 1 will eventually fail if you never audit it. You have built the machine, and you have trained the machine. Now you must learn how to keep the machine alive. Chapter 7, Upgrade Cycle. You have built the machine. You have selected your kernel rules. You have erected an emotional firewall. You have constructed a decision engine, and you have driven the entire architecture deep into your nervous system through relentless training. You look at your life, and you feel a dangerous sense of finality. You think the work is done. You think that because you finally understand how to operate under pressure, you will never fail again. This is a massive delusion. The environment around you is constantly shifting. Your goals are changing. Your internal weaknesses are mutating to bypass your new defenses. If you freeze your philosophy in this exact moment, it will eventually shatter. This chapter will slowly reveal the hidden mechanism that separates a temporary breakthrough from permanent sovereignty. You will discover why the greatest systems in the world are never actually finished, and you will learn how to keep your personal philosophy alive, adaptive, and ruthlessly honest. By the time you finish this section, you will understand that true mastery is not about building a perfect system once. It is about running a continuous cycle of destruction and renewal. The inevitability of the crash. Every single system crashes. The question is not whether your personal philosophy will fail you at some point. The question is whether you will learn from the failure or blindly defend the broken code. Most men choose to defend the broken code. They experience a massive failure in their career or their relationships, and instead of examining the architecture that led to the crash, they explain it away. They blame the economy, they blame their partner, they blame their boss, and they blame their circumstances. When you refuse to examine your crashes, those unexamined crashes eventually harden into your personality. You become the angry guy, you become the bitter guy, you become the guy who always quits right before the finish line. This is an identity-level confrontation. If you cannot revise your code completely owns you. Growth dies the exact moment your loyalty to a specific philosophy matters more than the objective truth of your results. A philosophy that you cannot debug becomes a psychological cage. You must understand the stark contrast between a winner and a loser in the aftermath of a failure. Winners audit what breaks. Losers explain away what breaks. Winners evolve their system based on cold data. Losers worship their old build because it flatters their ego. A loser wants to be right. A winner wants to be effective. The mechanics of iteration. To prevent your philosophy from becoming a cage, you must install the upgrade cycle. This is a continuous, recurring process of auditing, patching, replacing, and retesting your internal code. Maintenance is not proof of failure. Maintenance is the ultimate proof of strength. A recurring review process protects you against the slow, invisible drift that ruins most men. It protects you against the rigidity that turns disciplined men into brittle tyrants. The foundation of this cycle is version control. In software engineering, version control is the practice of tracking exactly what was changed, when it was changed, and why it was changed. You must apply this exact same logic to your belief system. You cannot rely on your memory to track your personal growth. Memory alone is incredibly flattering and highly selective. Your brain will rewrite history to make you look like the hero. You must track what you believed, what you changed, and what you tested over time in a written format. Written records reveal the brutal truth of your actual growth versus the illusion of your philosophical fashion. As you run this cycle, you must master the distinction between a patch and a replacement. You patch a principle when the core rule is completely sound, but your physical application of it is weak. The architecture is good, but the execution is sloppy. You replace a principle entirely when the rule itself keeps producing distortion and damage in your life. If a rule consistently makes you miserable, isolated, and ineffective, you do not tweak it. You rip it out of the kernel, and you replace it with better code. After every single change, you must retest the system in reality to see whether your physical conduct actually improves. The rot of unexamined success. You must observe how this rigidity manifests in the daily reality of your life. Consider a career scenario where your initial strength slowly turns into a fatal rigidity. You installed a kernel rule about extreme discipline, and it got you massive results. You secured the promotion, you built the business, and you outworked your competition. But over time, that exact same discipline starts making you controlling, paranoid, and incredibly brittle. You snap at your team, you micromanage every detail, and you burn out. Without an upgrade cycle, you will defend this toxic rigidity as simply having high standards. You will alienate everyone around you and call it the price of greatness. With an upgrade cycle, you recognize the crash. You patch the behavior without abandoning the core value of hard work. Look at a relationship scenario where the concept of acceptance slowly rots into pure passivity. You tell yourself that you're practicing stoic acceptance of your partner's flaws. You use the language of ancient wisdom to justify your silence, but the brutal truth is that you are simply avoiding an honest, uncomfortable confrontation. Without a recurring review, your wisdom language becomes a convenient cover for your cowardice. With a review, you catch the lie. You separate true strategic surrender from weak passivity, and you initiate the hard conversation. Observe a meaning scenario where your old rules simply no longer fit your current reality. You go through a massive life transition. You change careers, you move across the world, or you experience a profound loss. The code that carried you through your 20s cannot carry you through this new terrain. Without updating your system, your philosophy feels incredibly stale, forced, and performative. You are running old software on new hardware and wondering why the machine keeps freezing. With updating, you preserve the absolute core of your identity while completely adjusting the modules to fit the new environment. Finally, consider a personal growth scenario where drift is heavily disguised as maturity. You slowly loosen your standards over time. You stop waking up early, you stop executing your drills, and you call it finding balance. You stop reviewing your failures because your current level of progress flatters your ego. You slowly and quietly return to your default programming, but this time you are armed with much more sophisticated language to justify your laziness. The upgrade cycle is the only mechanism that catches this invisible drift before it ruins you. When you do not audit your success becomes your greatest vulnerability. You start believing your own hype. You start thinking that your current level of execution is a permanent trait rather than a daily rented condition. You stop doing the boring, unglamorous drills that built your foundation in the first place. You replace sweat with arrogance. You replace curiosity with certainty, and you replace the brutal truth with comfortable lies. The upgrade cycle forces you to look in the mirror every single month and admit that you are still flawed, you are still vulnerable, and you still have massive blind spots that need to be engineered out of your code. The diagnostic protocol. To execute this cycle, you must run a monthly operating system audit. Once every 30 days, you sit down and answer 5 ruthless questions. What exactly broke this month? What held firm under extreme pressure? What specific situations kept draining your energy? What principle completely failed to transfer from theory into physical action? What needs a minor patch and what needs a total replacement? You pair this audit with a version log. Whenever you experience a significant crash, you record the exact principle you attempted to use. You record the specific situation that tested it. You record the brutal, objective result of your action. Then, you record the exact adjustment you are making to the code. Your correction protocol requires you to trace every crash backward to its source. You never stop at the surface level. You start with the visible failure, such as losing your temper in a meeting. You identify the behavior pattern beneath it, which is reacting instantly to perceived disrespect. You identify the hidden belief or missing module beneath that pattern, which is the false belief that your status depends on dominating every conversation. Finally, you decide whether to patch your physical behavior, refine the kernel rule, or replace the rule entirely. The tricks to maintaining this cycle are vital. You must review your system on a strict schedule, not only after a massive disaster strikes. You must patch the actual architecture of your mind, not just your public image. You must measure your success by your recovery speed, not by your perfection. Strong systems do not pretend to be flawless. Strong systems stay incredibly flexible under the crushing weight of the truth. You must adopt a new micro-rule for this phase of your development. No identity loyalty to tools. You are the sovereign engineer of your life, not the label on the toolbox. You use philosophies to get a job done. You do not marry them. If a module stops serving your reality, you replace it without a second thought. You do not owe any philosopher your blind obedience. You owe yourself a life that actually works. When you run the version log, you are building a personalized textbook of your own psychology. You are documenting your own specific brand of madness, and your own specific pathways to clarity. Over time, this log becomes the most valuable document you own. It is a map of every trap you have ever fallen into and every ladder you have ever built to climb out. You stop guessing what might work, and you start executing what has already been proven to work in the laboratory of your own life. System failures and patches. As you attempt to debug your life, your ego will fight back with several predictable traps. You must anticipate these failures and correct them immediately. You might identify way too strongly with one specific philosophy. You become a rigid fanatic, defending a dead emperor's words even when they are actively destroying your modern life. Fix this by evaluating every single rule strictly by the physical results it produces, not by your emotional loyalty to the brand or the image. You might patch the superficial symptoms while completely ignoring the root causes. You try to fix your tone of voice while ignoring the deep resentment fueling it. Fix this by tracing each repeated failure all the way back to the foundational rule or the missing module beneath it. You might become overly self-critical and lose all of your forward momentum. You use the audit process to beat yourself up and wallow in shame. Fix this by tracking your recovery speed and your lesson extraction instead of chasing an impossible standard of perfection. The goal is to fix the machine, not to punish the operator. You might stop reviewing your system the second your life improves. You hit a stable period, you make some money, your relationships calm down, and you abandon the audit. Fix this by scheduling your monthly audits even during the most peaceful, stable periods of your life. Peace is when you sharpen the sword. You might mistake passivity for profound wisdom. You let people walk all over you, and you call it emotional control. Fix this by brutally asking yourself what necessary, uncomfortable action your supposed acceptance is actually helping you avoid. The evolution of the living machine. When you successfully run this upgrade cycle, your life evolves through 3 distinct tiers of mastery. At the good level, you completely stop repeating the exact same obvious mistakes for months at a time. You become brutally honest with yourself about where your system fails. You notice the subtle drift of your standards significantly sooner, and you correct your trajectory before you crash into the wall. At the excellent level, your personal growth becomes highly measurable instead of vague and emotional. You adapt to massive new life conditions without ever losing your core stability. Your personal philosophy becomes incredibly precise, highly useful, and completely devoid of performative nonsense. You know exactly what works for you and exactly what does not. At the best level, you develop a living, breathing operating system that actually improves under extreme pressure. Failure completely ceases to be a source of shame and becomes pure, actionable data. You no longer fear the crash because you know the crash is just the blueprint for the next upgrade. You become the absolute engineer of your own continuous evolution. A system that updates well can now become exponentially more powerful. You have the core, you have the firewall, you have the engine, you have the training, and you have the maintenance cycle. But there is one final threat to the architecture you have built. The next threat is philosophical provincialism. You have built a strong system, but you are likely relying on only one type of tool to solve every single problem in your life. One tradition alone cannot possibly solve every class of chaos you will face. Now you must learn how to run multiple, highly potent modules simultaneously without tearing your mind apart with contradiction. Chapter 8: Parallel Minds. You are trying to survive a highly complex war using nothing but a single weapon. At some point in your past, you discovered a specific philosophy that helped you survive a dark period. Perhaps it was the cold logic of a Roman emperor that saved you from a panic attack, or the relentless discipline of a samurai that pulled you out of a deep depression. Because that single tool saved you, you made a fatal miscalculation. You decided to turn that one tool into your entire identity. You became a man with a hammer, wandering through life treating every single complex human problem like a nail. But if every problem gets the exact same philosophical answer, you will inevitably mishandle half of your existence. This chapter will slowly dismantle your loyalty to a single tradition. You will discover the hidden architecture used by the most adaptable operators in history, and you will learn how to run multiple, seemingly contradictory systems at the exact same time. By the time you finish this section, you will understand the true meaning of the title of this chapter, and you will possess the blueprint for a multi-core internal operating system. The trap of the single hammer. One hammer thinking makes you incredibly weak. Human life is not a uniform experience. It is a chaotic, shifting landscape that demands entirely different responses depending on the terrain. Some situations demand absolute, unyielding firmness. Other situations demand strategic yielding and fluid adaptability. Some crises require endless endurance, others require a desperate search for meaning, and others require nothing but quiet, immediate presence. When you try to force a single philosophy to solve all of these problems, you distort the philosophy and you destroy your own effectiveness. This is an identity-level confrontation. You do not need a philosophy that makes you look pure to the outside world. You need a system that makes you effective, stable, and clear in the actual trenches of your life. A rigid mind loves one tool because learning several feels infinitely harder, and because adopting a single label feels like joining a safe tribe. But safety is an illusion. This exposes the brutal contrast between a winner and a loser in the realm of deep integration. Winners assign philosophies specific jobs. Losers collect philosophies as decorative identities. Winners integrate different traditions with surgical precision. Losers blend them together with lazy vagueness until they mean absolutely nothing. A loser says he is a Stoic, and then uses that label to justify his inability to connect with his family. A winner uses Stoicism to handle a career setback and then seamlessly switches to a different framework to listen to his child. The multi-core architecture. To achieve this level of adaptability, you must build what is known as parallel minds. In computer engineering, a multi-core processor handles different, highly complex tasks simultaneously without crashing the system. Parallel minds is the exact same concept applied to your internal architecture. It is the practice of running different philosophical modules by design in entirely different domains of your life. This multi-core architecture drastically increases your adaptability without ever losing your internal coherence. Role clarity prevents contradiction. When every tool has a specific job, the tools never fight each other. There are 5 core modules you must learn to run in parallel. The first is the Stoic module. This is your engine for adversity, objective judgment, and emotional steadiness. The second is the Zen module. This is your engine for presence, deep attention, and drastically reduced reaction lag. The third is the Taoist module. This is your engine for timing, strategic leverage, and the absolute refusal to force an outcome. The fourth is the Bushido module. This is your engine for ruthless discipline, constant readiness, and decisive physical action. The fifth is the Existentialist module. This is your engine for meaning, radical freedom, and chosen responsibility when the universe feels completely absurd. As you install these modules, you will notice profound moments of convergence and divergence. Convergence happens where different traditions arrive at the exact same truth from entirely different paths. But divergence is where the real power lies. Real differences remain between these traditions, and those differences matter deeply. You do not flatten them to make them sound the same. You use them. The tension between these modules can actually become your greatest strength if you know exactly when each mode should take the lead. This allows you to move far beyond simplistic loyalty and build a smarter, infinitely more flexible machine. The crucible of cross-cultural combat. You must see how these parallel minds operate in the chaotic reality of your daily life. Consider a career scenario involving extreme pressure, delicate timing, and the need for absolute presence. A massive project is failing and the boardroom is in a panic. The Stoic module helps you interpret the setbacks cleanly, stripping away the panic and leaving only the objective facts. But Stoicism alone might make you rigid, so the Taoist module steps in to help you avoid forcing the wrong move too early, teaching you to wait for the natural leverage point in the market. Meanwhile, the Zen module helps you stay intensely present in the live conversations, allowing you to hear what your clients are actually saying instead of listening to your own internal anxiety. Look at a relationship scenario where you must navigate conflict without causing a total collapse. Your partner is angry, and the conversation is escalating rapidly. The Zen module helps you hear the words being spoken without any reactive distortion or ego defense. The Stoic module helps you govern your internal judgment, allowing you to take absolute ownership of your side of the mess without taking responsibility for their emotional state. But the Taoist module is the ultimate key here. It helps you choose exactly when yielding is a highly strategic move rather than a sign of weakness. You stop fighting the current and you let their anger pass without giving it a wall to crash against. Observe a money scenario requiring both relentless discipline and strategic patience. You are trying to build wealth, but the market is moving against you. The Bushido module helps you hold your absolute standards when the comfort of quitting calls your name. It forces you to execute the daily work. The Stoic module helps you separate the biological fear in your chest from the mathematical facts on the spreadsheet. But the Taoist module helps you stop wasting your precious effort on brute force moves that have terrible leverage. It teaches you to stop swimming against the financial tide and start looking for the hidden currents. Finally, consider a meaning scenario where you achieve success but feel completely empty inside. You hit the target, you get the money, and you realize it did not fix your soul. The Existentialist module helps you when achievement fails to answer the question of why you are alive. It forces you to construct your own meaning from the void. The Stoic module helps you continue to act well and fulfill your duties within reality, even when you feel lost. The Zen module helps you stop outsourcing your life to future fantasies, forcing you to find the profound depth in the exact, ordinary moment you are currently standing in. The cartography of the mind. To run these systems without losing your mind, you must build a module map. A module map is a written, physical assignment of exactly which tradition handles which specific class of problem in your life. Mapping beats vague thinking. If you just tell yourself that you like all these philosophies, you will freeze under pressure. You must connect the exact tool to the exact trigger so your recall is instantaneous. Your map must have 5 clear territories. You assign an adversity module, a presence module, a strategy module, a discipline module, and a meaning module. To build this accurately, you must track which specific problems your current build handles poorly. Look at your life right now. Where do you keep forcing outcomes when leverage and patience would work infinitely better? Where do you stay highly disciplined but remain emotionally absent from your family? Where do you endure pain incredibly well but completely lose your sense of meaning and joy? Your correction protocol is strict. 1 role, 1 lead module. You assign each class of problem 1 primary philosophy that takes absolute command in that domain. You add secondary support only when it directly strengthens your clarity. You test this map in live, hostile situations, and you revise it based entirely on the physical results. The tricks to maintaining this architecture are vital. Do not blend the philosophies first. Map them first. If 2 modules conflict in your mind, you must define exactly which one leads in that specific domain. Keep your active modules limited so the system stays usable under fire. Depth always beats novelty. You must adopt a new micro-rule for this phase of your evolution. No undefined integration. If you cannot name the exact job a philosophy is supposed to do not install the module. If you cannot detect the specific use case in your daily life, the module will not help you under pressure. A philosophy without a clearly defined role is just intellectual noise. System failures and patches. As you attempt to run these parallel minds, your ego and your confusion will create predictable system failures. You must anticipate these bugs and patch them immediately. You might blend traditions into total contradiction. You try to be a ruthless warrior and a yielding sage in the exact same breath, and you end up paralyzed and confused. Fix this by assigning each tradition a crystal clear domain and a lead role. The warrior handles the execution of the work. The sage handles the strategy of the market. they do not share the steering wheel. You might flatten the real differences between these philosophies, pretending that every ancient master was secretly saying the exact same thing. They were not. Fix this by studying exactly where they diverge and deciding which specific stance serves your actual life best in that context. Tension is a tool. Use it. You might use one philosophy to completely escape the demands of another. You use Zen detachment to escape the heavy responsibility of existentialism. You use Taoist yielding to escape the brutal discipline of Bushido. Fix this by brutally asking yourself what responsibility, what discomfort, or what truth you are actively trying to avoid. You might become intellectually flashy, but behaviorally weak. You learn the terminology of 5 different traditions, and you use them to win arguments at dinner parties, but your private life remains a chaotic disaster. Fix this by testing every single module against real, high-stakes decisions instead of abstract, theoretical discussions. You might keep adding modules and never master any of them. You read a new book every week and try to install a new operating system every month. Fix this by capping your active build at the very few tools you can actually run under extreme pressure. An overloaded processor will always crash. The evolution of the universal operator. When you successfully run these parallel minds, your capability evolves through 3 distinct tiers of mastery. At the good level, you completely stop thinking in rigid, one-tradition terms. You stop looking for a single guru to hand you the ultimate answer to the universe. You begin seeing exactly why different human problems require entirely different strengths. You drastically reduce your philosophical confusion because you finally understand that contradiction is just a failure to assign proper roles. At the excellent level, you can integrate multiple traditions without ever muddying them. Your responses become highly adaptive across your work, your relationships, and your long-term strategy. You build a clear, cross-cultural framework for your life that respects the genius of the past without becoming a slave to it. You switch from endurance to leverage to presence without missing a single beat. At the best level, you operate from a multi-core philosophy that remains perfectly coherent under the most extreme pressure imaginable. You gain massive range without ever losing your core identity. Your system becomes incredibly resilient because it can meet almost any kind of reality with the exact right tool. You become a universal operator, unbound by geography, unbound by time, and completely sovereign over your own mind. The architecture is now fully ready. You have audited the bad code, gathered the source libraries, chosen your kernel rules, built the firewall, installed the engine, trained the reflexes, established the upgrade cycle, and mapped your parallel minds. The machine is sitting in the dark, fully fueled and perfectly engineered. But a strong system still dies if it is not lived. A perfect design means absolutely nothing if it remains trapped in your journal. The final threat is not a flaw in the design. The final threat is your own daily hesitation. The time for theory has officially ended. Now you must face the ultimate consequence of everything you have built and discover what happens when the machine is finally turned on. Chapter 9, Code Released. You are standing at the edge of a massive psychological trap. You have consumed this entire framework. You feel a deep sense of internal clarity, and you are currently convincing yourself that you have already transformed. You feel powerful because you finally understand the mechanics of your own mind, but you have not actually done anything yet. Reading about an operating system is not the same thing as running an operating system. The ultimate danger of philosophy is that it makes you feel competent before you have taken a single physical action. This final chapter will destroy the illusion of passive consumption and force you into active deployment. You will learn exactly how to translate everything you have built into the brutal, unforgiving reality of your daily existence. By the time you finish reading these final pages, you will face a simple, unavoidable choice between returning to your default programming or stepping into the world as the sovereign author of your own life. The architecture of your new mind. You must look back at the exact sequence of what you have just built, not to admire it, but to understand the weapon you are about to wield. You began this journey by identifying the invisible programming that was already running your life. You exposed the silent installers of your family, your culture, and your algorithms. You stopped treating ancient philosophies as rigid identities and started treating them as highly functional source libraries. You extracted the exact code you needed, and you chose the 3 to 5 kernel rules that can actually survive real pressure. But you did not stop at theory. You built an emotional firewall so that your biological feelings became useful data rather than sovereign commands. You installed a decision engine so that the chaos of a crisis could not outrun your principles. You utilized a training loop so your high standards became accessible under extreme stress. You implemented an upgrade cycle so your system could evolve instead of hardening into a brittle cage. You deployed parallel minds so that different human problems received the exact right philosophical tool. The final principle you must accept is that a philosophy is only real when it governs your physical conduct. Wisdom that does not transfer to pressure is still completely unfinished. You do not need any more admiration for ancient warriors or dead emperors. You need more execution in your own living reality. The architecture is complete. Now you must turn the key. The death of the drift. When you finally release this code into your daily life, the level of empowerment you experience will be staggering. Agency completely replaces drift. You can now catch your inherited scripts in real time instead of obeying them blindly. When the urge to panic, please, or attack rises in your chest, you see it as a line of bad code rather than a mandate from the universe. You make your decisions from your chosen principles instead of your borrowed moods. You respond to extreme pressure with rigid structure instead of improvising from a place of pure panic. Stability completely replaces volatility. You recover infinitely faster after massive setbacks. You no longer need perfect, quiet conditions to act like yourself. You become incredibly hard to manipulate by praise, by fear, by insult, or by uncertainty. When someone tries to flatter you into submission or insult you into a reaction, they hit the firewall and fail. Deep, quiet confidence completely replaces loud performance. You trust yourself more because you finally have physical evidence of your own trained behavior. You stop confusing loudness with strength. You stop outsourcing your identity to the admiration of strangers. You know exactly what you will do when the floor drops out, which means you no longer have to walk around pretending to be tough. You now possess real-time internal command. You can separate your feeling from your action while the pressure is still peaking. You possess greater strategic range, allowing you to use discipline without rigidity, acceptance without passivity, and calm without numbness. You experience a total identity level shift. You stop living as a patched-together reaction machine, and you begin operating as a man with a deliberately designed inner architecture. The relational payoff. This internal sovereignty does not just change you. It radically alters every single relationship in your life. When your code is clean, your emotional conduct becomes impeccable. You hear criticism from your partner or your peers with significantly less defensiveness. You stop making the people you love pay the price for your own unprocessed emotion. You become incredibly calm during intense conflict without ever becoming weak or passive. Your communication becomes terrifyingly clear. You say exactly what is true without any theatrical aggression. You set hard boundaries without letting resentment build up in your chest. You apologize much more cleanly because your ego no longer needs to win every single minor exchange. You stop playing games because you no longer need external validation to feel secure in your own skin. This creates a massive aura of trustworthiness around you. People quickly learn that your reactions are not random. They realize that you do not change your personality based on the weather, the economy, or the mood of the room. Your standards become entirely visible through your relentless consistency. Reliability becomes a physical part of your presence. You become easier to trust, infinitely harder to manipulate, and highly capable of real, grounded leadership. Men will follow you, and women will trust you because they can sense that your foundation does not shake when the wind blows. The physics of compounding execution. You might fear that maintaining this system will require an exhausting amount of willpower for the rest of your life. But that is not how the physics of human behavior work. Continuing to practice these concepts will actually improve your results with less and less effort over time. This is the compounding effect of daily boots. Every single day, you either run your system consciously or you return to your old defaults. When you run the system daily, repetition drastically lowers your hesitation. Clear rules completely eliminate your decision fatigue. Trained responses significantly reduce your emotional drag. What feels incredibly forced and mechanical at first becomes entirely automatic with use. What once required 10 minutes of deep reflection becomes a split-second reflex through rehearsal. What once looked like agonizing discipline to the outside world starts to feel exactly like your natural identity. This is the path to long-term mastery. Your system becomes more stable under bigger and bigger pressure. Your monthly reviews become sharper and more efficient. Your philosophy requires absolutely zero performance because it is permanently built into your physical conduct. You stop trying to be a philosopher and you simply become a highly effective man. The immediate deployment protocol. You cannot wait until tomorrow to start. You must execute the immediate deployment protocol the second you finish this book. The first thing you must do is write down your version 1.0 personal operating system. You will list your 3 to 5 kernel rules in plain, brutal language on a single piece of paper. You will name your top 3 crash patterns right beneath those rules. You will assign one specific detection method and one specific fix to each of those crash patterns. You will carry this document with you everywhere. Next, you will schedule your first weekly review. You will block out 20 minutes on your calendar for this exact weekend. During that review, you will ask yourself, what held firm this week? What broke this week? What needs a patch? And what specific situation needs rehearsal next? Then, you will choose one immediate live test. You will not wait for life to test you. You will test yourself within the next 24 hours. You will choose one career situation where you will actively use the decision engine. You will choose one relationship situation where you will actively use the emotional firewall. You will choose one discipline situation where you will actively use the training loop. You will walk into the fire on purpose. Finally, you will initiate the daily boot sequence every single morning for the rest of your life. Before you look at your phone, before you check your email, and before you let the world program your mind, you will run the sequence. You will read your kernel rules. You will recall your most likely stress test for the upcoming day. You will decide your first principled response before the day even begins. You boot the system before the chaos boots you. The final choice. You have reached the final identity challenge. Your life is going to run on code either way. You cannot opt out of having an operating system. If you refuse to write it yourself, your default programming will simply continue to write it for you. The algorithm will dictate your anger, your culture will dictate your desires, and your unhealed wounds will dictate your reactions. Delay is still surrender. Waiting for the perfect moment to start is just a sophisticated way of choosing to remain weak. This is the ultimate contrast between the winner and the loser. Winners ship version 1.0 and they improve it in public reality. They take their messy, imperfect system out into the world and they let the friction of life sharpen the blade. Losers wait for perfect clarity. They stay trapped in their borrowed code, reading endless books, collecting endless quotes, and never taking a single step into the arena. Winners build, losers browse. Start before you feel ready. Test the system before you feel certain. Review your failures before you have a chance to judge yourself. Build the system, run the system, and become the absolute author of the system. You do not need another man's operating system. You do not need to copy a billionaire, a monk, or an emperor. You need code that actually survives the brutal, beautiful reality of your own specific life. You have the tools, you have the architecture, you have the map, but the map is not the territory, and the reading is now over. In exactly 10 seconds, you are going to close this book. The quiet room will fade away, and the chaotic pressure of the real world will hit you squarely in the chest. The fire is coming. The only question left is what you will do when you feel the heat.